transition out of field teaching and implications for practice. So I'd like to acknowledge country first. In Australia, this is very common practice as we start our presentations. I'm on Camaragal people land of the Eora Nation. I'm on the lower North Shore of Sydney. Here is where I work and study the land and the waterways of the Wattamatagal people of Darug Nation. This is the learning circle on our university grounds, where often I conduct a lot of my geography methodology classes, particularly when we're doing field work. So I would like to acknowledge country and extend my respect to Aboriginal elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to just sort of state up front that these are results from my doctoral research, but I didn't set out to research out of field teaching. I set out to look at the transition experience of pre-service teachers as they transition into the profession and how this transition affects their transformation of pedagogical practice. What happened during the course of the 18 months that I followed my participants was that out of field teaching became part of their transition experience. If I'm not across some of the literature that you'd be expecting me to, it's because out of field teaching is not necessarily my area of expertise. It was within geography education, and out of field teaching became part of the experience. Some of you here know that I recently submitted my thesis, so it's under examination at the moment. So I would like to thank my supervisors in absentia, Associate Professor Michael Kavanagh and Professor Mary Ryan at Macquarie University, who've given me exceptional guidance all the way through. And of course, the participants who stayed with me and have enabled me to share their stories. And Linda, I'd like to thank you, because this has given me something really new and interesting to think about in terms of my research for geography, and being introduced to your out of field teaching group and the TAS Collective has been, in the last few months, has been something I've really enjoyed. So thank you, Linda, too. So what I would like to sort of talk to you about today, and just give a quick background to my study so you know how out of field came to be part of it, and then talk about the experiences that the participants went through in terms of how they managed their out of field teaching experience, and then raise some questions, I guess, for what this might mean for initial teacher education and secondary school contexts. So as a quick background to the study, my focus was all about transition and transformation. So it was a longitudinal qualitative study conducted in 3 phases over 18 months, and spectacularly disrupted by COVID-19 last year as well, but we got through it and submitted on time. So that's always a bonus. I've got purposefully sampled participants. It's just a small group, but they were purposefully sampled from a geography methodology class at a university in Sydney. I analysed the results using Margaret Archer's reflexivity theory, and I'll go through that a bit later on. And my whole study was sort of conceptualised around reflection and pedagogy. And as part of the study, we used a sustained and emphasised approach towards getting the participants to engage with theory, practice, reflection. So the aim of my study really was to understand the experience of transition and to be able to understand how my participants' pedagogical practice transformed during this time. And whilst doing that, I also really wanted to test out whether the professional standards for the teaching of geography actually stood up as a reflective and pedagogical tool, because they were derived from the practice of very experienced teachers 10 years ago. And I wanted to see if they stood up for the pre-service and early career teacher context. So that's the background to my study, and the 3 phases here. So phase 1, preparation. This covered their final year of university, their final year of initial teacher education. So I've tracked them through prac, through their geography methodology classes. And then I followed them into a phase called profession entry, where they were accredited to teach. They got their provisional accreditation. They were allowed to be paid for the work that they did in schools, and they were just entering the profession. And then phase 3 was the longest phase, and that occurred throughout all of last year when they were all positioned in schools. And I did this through 3 social labs, 1 in each stage, and I'll talk about the social labs as I go through. Lesson observations and interviews. And obviously the plan was to be able to do lesson observation and interviews with my participants in phase 3 as well, but that was not possible. So in the end, we just had to kind of stick with the social labs and the interviews via Zoom. But nevertheless, we got there in the end. So just a bit of background about geography education. You know, it's a difficult space to work in because as a subject, we have an identity problem. You know, we cut across the sciences and the social sciences. And in schools, we're typically positioned within the humanities and social sciences. So a lot of the science actually can be lost. And then when geography, if students go on to study geography at university, it looks very different because geography is often absorbed into geosciences or a broader faculty of science and engineering. It's also cut into arts. Sometimes it occurs in schools of architecture. So geography at university is very fragmented as well. So we do have a bit of an identity problem in trying to work out what this subject actually is and what its rigor is and why it's relevant. The other problem within geography education is this gap or chasm that exists not only between what geography looks like in schools and universities, but also the career pathways that enable you to identify as a geographer. The perception or value of geography is questioned a lot by teachers, by students, by the public, by academics. We're always asked who we are and what we stand for, and are we more than just colouring in is a common but very frustrating joke that we often have to put up with. And I guess part of the problem as well is that in Australia, and I guess a lot of this, this may be familiar to you international visitors here today, but I guess I'm talking from a predominantly Australian context as well. Is that only 19 out of 37 universities in Australia offer the opportunity for pre-service teachers to specialise in geography education. So only 19 out of 37 universities offer a geography methodology course. And this is, we believe, part of the problem because it limits the amount of geography teachers that are able to graduate, which then obviously limits the amount that are in schools, and then sort of your whole, or contributes to the out of field teaching phenomenon occurring. We've also got a strategic plan for geography, and we've got a chapter designated to geography education in Australian schools. And part of the work ahead of us is trying to get the science side of geography recognised as part of a partial STEM subject, and also to have a look at what's happening in initial teacher education because of the lack of provision of geography methodology courses. And we have calls to address the extent of out of field teaching. I think many of us have probably read the report, particularly in Australia anyway, by Weldon, where he's giving the you know, percentages of teachers that are at the time understood to be teaching out of field in various subjects, and geography has a fairly large proportion of that. So I guess after the background, I guess I'd like to go through, well, how did my participants manage the out of field teaching phenomenon? And so I guess I'd like to start by sort of saying that for me anyway, I looked at out of field teaching through the lens of subject specialisation and stage qualification, but it was also about whether my participants identified themselves as being in an out of field context. And then of course, looking at the scale or degree to which out of field teaching is occurring, because within our social science or our humanities faculty, you know, as we'll see, they're still within their department that they're recruited in, but they're not necessarily teaching the subjects that they studied to do at uni. So there's this sort of element of degree or scale. So they're the areas within which I looked at out of field teaching. So how did they manage it? Ultimately, they managed it through the sustained and explicit emphasis on theory, practice, reflection. And what this meant was that every time I spoke to them, whether it was in an interview after their lesson or an interview that we scheduled during COVID times, or whether we were working as a group in the social labs. This question just kept coming up. What is it that makes your geography lesson geographical? And they needed to be able to come up with an answer. And then we were connecting it to any combination of the 9 professional standards for the accomplished teaching of geography that exist. We were also looking at the environment within which they were working. So not only did they have to really start to be able to clearly articulate what it is that was distinctive about their geography lesson and then attach it to theory, they also had to be able to interpret the context within which they were teaching. And to do that, they needed to be able to understand what their personal values and beliefs are about being a teacher and about geography teaching. They needed to be able to understand what some of the structural constraints were or enablers were that they were working with. So what was the timetabling situation like? What were some evidence bases that they could draw on to help to support their practice? And what was the culture that they were working in like? So as they work through their teaching context and their study context, they're identifying a range of emergent properties that are affecting their practice. And then they deliberate whether they enable or support them or constrain or hold them back. And when they work out which are the most influential properties on their practice, then they work towards dedicating action to be able to either maximize the enabling effect or minimize the constraint. And so this was the theory practice reflection activity that we did numerous times over 18 months, where they examined their context and went through emergent properties and then enabling or constraining, what am I going to do about it, in conjunction with thinking about what the distinctive features of their geography lesson were, and then connecting that to theory. These are the social labs. It's a dialogic collaborative space. And this was something altogether, the theory practice reflection and the working together in a safe space dialogically with each other, having that shared experience. Eventually they all discovered that they're all teaching out of field, you know, and so that fear, I suppose, started to dissipate because there was this connection that they had with each other anyway, and there was a connection with me because I did know my participants before they were recruited to the study. I had taught them at the university, although I wasn't teaching them in the years that they were in my study. So there was this sort of safe and trusted atmosphere between each other as well. So within the 3 phases, what happened? So phase 1 was about professional experience, and they didn't experience out of field teaching then. However, Anna at this stage, and these are pseudonyms, she was a history major, whereas the others were all geography majors. So she actually self-identified as feeling out of field for geography, and she chose to do the methodology course as an additional subject, and she paid extra to do it and kind of jammed up her timetable because she'd figured out she was going to be likely to teach geography. But personally, she often in phase 1 and also during phase 2 sort of would come out with these statements about feeling less trained, not always having confidence in her ability. But then gradually, as phase 1 went on, she started to be able to apply the process of what it means to teach historically, and then how I was hammering her about, well, what does it mean to teach geographically? And she was applying it and working out where she could find some information to sort of help support her practice. And so this idea that she thinks about what she knows in a subject that she's very familiar with, and she's applying it into geography that she feels very unfamiliar with. And she was able to make her lessons work. During profession entry, which was the time when they'd actually finished their course in the initial teacher education program and were going into their first job really, and all of them entered precariously. So they all were entered as casual day-to-day relief teachers. All of them, all my participants reported out of field teaching as an entry point to the profession. That was it. What signifies your entry point to the profession? Out of field teaching. That was the number 1 thing. The structural constraints to their practice was that they didn't feel well prepared in initial teacher education. Timetables they were given were predominantly out of field, and obviously precarious employment didn't help. So it was casual day-to-day work. And they were self-identifying, but there were varying degrees of scale. So it was always within HISI, so it was commerce or business studies or something like that, but it wasn't geography or history. So the structural constraints. So when we're looking at the practice of Matt, Matt was quite concerned by teaching commerce, and he said, I feel constrained by this. I've not been prepared for it at university. It reduces my excitement for teaching. Other structural constraints are beautifully summed up in Karen's quote here. She was casual teaching across 2 schools, teaching multiple subjects, art, commerce, legal studies, future learning, and I'm trained in only one of these. So I'm learning new subjects, I'm learning content, I'm learning about the school, I'm learning to meet new people, and now I'm having problems with classroom management. And, you know, it was a very disruptive time for her. When we look at the personal enablers though, because that was also part of it, sorry, I forgot to replace this. Sorry, that one is not meant to be there. That's not a personal enabler for Matt. He felt constrained about teaching commerce, but he felt confident in his ability to teach geography. And that's where he started to be able to apply what we were doing in the doctoral study to be able to figure out how he might start going about teaching commerce. For Anna, it was about inquiry and the belief that getting to know students and using inquiry as a mechanism to be able to connect with students and get some form of learning happening was an enabler for her that enabled her to be able to respond and cope with teaching a variety of subjects. During phase 3, positioned in schools, what indicates your experience of transition into the profession after a whole year of being in one school, and they all said out of field teaching. What were the structural constraints? They're still about timetabling, school organisation and timetabling. How is out of field teaching being identified now? It's about stage, it's about specialisation, it's about scale, and still identifying themselves as out of field teachers or not. So often they would often use the words they felt overwhelmed and they felt underprepared during their first year of teaching when they were presented with and had to teach this out of field teaching load. And we did a year in review activity, and Anna probably had the most disruptive of all of them because she moved to regional New South Wales as well, which we know is also indicative of being likely to teach out of field as well. So she moved churches, homes, cities. She was coordinating subjects. She was observed by a prac student. She was teaching boys, but she'd only have a prac in an all-girls school. And to top it off, she taught in the primary school. She taught technology. And then she knew at the end of 2020 that she was going to be teaching languages this year. So she'd had a fairly difficult year that was characterised by an out-of-field teaching load. But again, the whole idea, and she spoke about earlier how she thought about history and used that process and then felt confident to implement it in geography, which is what we were doing. She then took that process of what we were doing in geography, what makes your lesson distinctive, can I connect it to theory, all right, what's important to me about being a teacher, how can I make this work in my classroom? She used all of that and wrapped it up for teaching in primary, teaching technology, teaching languages, reaching out to networks. And by the end of last year, she was identifying herself as a specialist geography teacher. There was no more talk about her being out of field for geography, although she identified herself as being an out of field teacher for other subjects. The structural enablers, so how did they manage it, and the personal ones. So the structural ones are up here. And for all of them, it was about reaching out to networks, whether that be in person or social media, and being able to apply a theory practice reflection process to their out of field teaching context. Personally, what enabled them, it was their values and beliefs about what it means to be a teacher or what it meant to be a geography teacher. So Emily, every time I spoke to her right from the beginning, she was always, I'm a specialist geography teacher. She was a career changer as well. So she didn't want to be bothered with teaching a subject that wasn't geography because she'd given up a career, done her training and had chosen to teach geography. So she used this as an argument against what her head teacher was proposing, because her head teacher wanted her to be able to teach commerce and business studies to kind of open the world of Hizzy up to her. And Emily was like, no, I'm not doing it. I'm a specialist geography teacher. I'm not doing out of field teaching. It's not going to help the students. It's not going to help me. She actually shared some of the research that I'd shared with her, you know, from Linda and Duplessis and others, to convince her head teacher, and she was successful. She didn't have an out of field teaching load for 2020. All of them, though, Anna, Grace, Karen, they all spoke about this value, about what it means to be a teacher and what's important in teaching practice anyway. And they used that to be able to get them to kind of overcome the constraint of out of field teaching. So it was always bringing it back to what the students knew, their local context, being able to engage with them. It was about developing relationships, using inquiry, and their, you know, really strongly felt responsibility that they've been presented with this class, and these students have to learn something, you know, and it's their job to be able to provide the best education possible. So they joined the Professional Teachers Association. They taught themselves a lot. They asked me for a lot of readings because I still had access to a lot of resources through the university to be able to help them. And ultimately it came down to the fact that teaching is not an individual profession. And in the end, for Karen in particular, it was about learning together with her students. So overall, what helped my participants mitigate the constraint of out of field teaching? It was the mentoring structure that was provided actually through the social lab, really, but also through my one-to-one time with them. So we had the social labs as a group, and then we had fairly regular one-to-one interviews where we were still going through the same processes that we went through in the social lab. And they all felt that that provided not only a safe space, but also a bit of mentoring, because it wasn't my place to critique or review their teaching. It was just to help them work through their enabling and constraining influences on their teaching practice. And so in a way, the doctoral study group became a bit of a bridge between, you know, us all working together and leaving university in terms of the geography methodology class and entering schools. And because a few of them jumped around a bit and all ended up in different schools anyway, the doctoral study group provided consistency, I suppose, and help them feel connected with each other. The other ways that they mitigated it was obviously through their pedagogical practice, and for them, they were very familiar with inquiry-based pedagogies, being, you know, geography and also humanities trained. So they sort of applied that together with their belief about relationship building with students to manage the change. Then they also made a purposeful effort to engage with the communities of practice within the school and beyond the school, such as professional associations, Facebook groups, etc. And ultimately, it was their professional, personal values and beliefs about what it means to be a teacher. And it's their responsibility to teach these students no matter what they're faced. And that's what got them through. So the implications for initial teacher education and secondary school context, I'm not sure I have a lot of answers for that, in all honesty, because this wasn't the true focus of my study. It kind of emerged along the way. But I guess it's raised some questions and ideas for research that I have. And so I guess it's about, and I think we talked about this in the longitudinal study breakout room earlier, about, well, how can universities provide, you know, access to methodology classes when you know that there's certain subjects in combination that are going to be taught out of field? Like, how can we support pre-service teachers better? If we look at the school, what can timetabling structure, how can timetabling structures be improved? I guess a question that I have from a geography perspective is that, why is it that my participants who were recruited as geography teachers spent a significant amount of time teaching out of field, yet other teachers were teaching geography who were not specialist teachers? Like, how can that happen? Why does that happen? And what role could school university partnerships have in creating what I would call a bridging mentoring program, where obviously it's optional to join, but I guess it would be someone like a methodology lecturer who's known to the students, who could travel with them during times of, I guess, uncertainty, particularly in that really, you know, employment precarious and emotional precarious time of transitioning into the profession. I guess something that I'm looking at for my own research as I settle into a lecturer role at university now is sort of looking at two groups of pre-service teachers to kind of almost try and repeat the study as best I can again, so track them. But this time have one group who goes through a geography methodology class to teach geography or anything else within the HISI, and those who are not completing a geography method class, but will probably teach it. What can we learn from that experience from those who do the methodology classes and end up teaching that subject, and those who don't? That's of an interest to me, and I guess something that arose as a result of my study. So like I said, I'd never set out on purpose to research out of field teaching, but it really emerged as quite a strong part of the transition experience. Theory, practice, reflection, inquiry, communities of practice, and personal values and beliefs about what it means to be a teacher was what got my participants through. And things that might need to be considered more fully within initial teacher education and also in schools would be timetabling, mentoring, mentoring courses and so on. So I hope you enjoy it, and thanks for letting me present today.